Yeah, it definitely was not my plan. By trade, I am a mechanical engineer. So I wanted to design mechanical systems or airplanes. And of course, like many people, life takes you different directions. Yeah, I mean, that was a situation, it's been a number of years ago now, where really the chemical industry experienced a very quick collapse of demand. And the business that I was in, we did not have a lot of cash, to say the least. So taking the inventory out and not wasting cash on inventory was pretty critical. Yeah, I mean, the thought process is quite different. And actually, I've spoke at some conferences sometimes, and some college professors that teach supply chain will come up to me after I speak and they'll be like, boy, we don't teach it that way. Maybe we need
Yeah.
to look at it differently, because back then, and you still see it in a lot of textbooks, everybody's like, keep your inventory in the raw materials.
Yep.
It's cheaper. Yeah, so basically, we only had one central warehouse in Europe, and it was full. It was very over capacity. And to expand that, because it had a lot of automation and things, was a very expensive proposition.
Welcome, everyone, to the Vserve Ebusiness Solution podcast on supply chain management, where we invite industry's great experts to share their experiences and also gather a lot of tips along the way. And today, we are exploring what happens when the global supply chain, fractures, and more importantly, the exact mechanics of how to rebuild it better. And I have a guest today here who is a global supply chain executive. He has spent over 20 years, stepping into a complex, high stakes environments to align broken system, recover risk exposed revenues. His name is William Duty, and we go by Bill or Billy. So, hi, Billy. Thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Hi, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming in. And I know, you have led so many global, supply chain operations. You were the head of supply chain at BYK Additives. That's a 1.4 billion chemical manufacturer. You were spearheaded a supply chain center of excellence for um, a lot of different, billion-dollar companies. So I want to start with, how did you end up in supply chain? Because that's always an amazing story to you. Was it something you planned on, or you just were thrown in and was like, figure it out?
Yeah, it definitely was not my plan. By trade, I am a mechanical engineer. So I wanted to design mechanical systems or airplanes. And of course, like many people, life takes you different directions. And for me, I joined a company that was just spinning off from Union Carbide, and it needed to set up its own systems and processes, etc. I got involved with that at the very beginning of my career, and I spent the first year, 2 years doing that. And that really laid a good foundation for me, because I learned how the end to end business works. I ended up doing a lot as part of that project. And when that project was finished, I was asked to come back into the business and lead the global supply chain. And I was like, well, I don't know anything about supply chain. And the answer was, well, we need somebody that understands the business. We need somebody that can manage projects and get things done, and you can learn the rest. So that happened about 28 years ago, and I have been in supply chain ever since.
Wow. And once you join, you don't ever want to leave. Is that true? That's what I've heard.
It is definitely true for me. I have never had any urge to leave supply chain. I've had opportunities to leave supply chain, but I enjoy it. It's something that I've seen a lot of things in the supply chain, and
Mhm.
I like making them better. I like seeing them work, and it's where I plan on staying.
That's perfect. That's such a great start to the podcast. And I will jump back and forth, I know, because I'm going to hear you say some crazy things here. But I know you began your career, when I look at your profile, as a global SAP implementator at GE. if I'm not wrong. So how did that, especially GE being, such a great company in supply chain to work for, how did that shape your, technical approach to the rest of your years ahead?
Yeah, and it kind of continues from the story we started. As I said, I started with a spin-off and putting systems in and processes to be a standalone company, and once that was finished, shortly after that, GE purchased that business, and it was more of the same. Now it had to be integrated within their business, and we had to put a different SAP in place. And again, it allowed me to learn and refine how a business operates, what's important, what's not. But probably the most important thing was it really drove the understanding of how the handshakes between the functions work. You
Mhm.
know, what I need from you and what you need from me, and how that works and how that connects. And that connectivity, by definition, is the supply chain, right? So,
Yep.
again, it really led me with a good fundamental basis for how I manage a supply chain.
Wow. So when we talk about North Star, I've seen a lot of that in your profile. What's the technicality behind it? What does that mean?
Well, one, I like making things simpler. I'm not one that likes to make things more complicated. So when we talk about, the North Star, I think, and part of this comes from the Six Sigma training I had early in my career as well. You got to define the problem.
Mhm.
It sounds simple, right? But
Yeah.
truly spend the time to define the problem and what success looks like and how you're going to measure success. Because if you do that right, the stuff in the middle and how you get there starts to take care of itself, because then you can engage people, you get people's buy-in, you get the smarter people in the room to help solve the problem, because now everybody's on the same page of what the problem is, what success looks like, how we measure success, and the rest is just in the middle, is getting
Yeah.
the work done.
Wow. Perfect. And when you talk about when you put all of this together, when you're working for an $8 billion company or a $10 billion company with 100 production sites, how does that translate into, say, forecasting or scheduling across so many obviously different regions, especially now in 2026 when everything is like kind of a question mark as to what will happen next day. How do you deal with that?
Well, and you're right, and I've said this multiple times. None of us can predict the future, and it'll be the companies that can respond to the changes best is the ones that'll succeed.
Mhm.
And when you think about, like you said, forecasting and planning, it really comes back to segmentation, understanding, I won't say what's important and not important, but how it behaves in terms of the volume, in terms of the stability of it, because that changes how you want to tackle it. You may tackle a very high volume, very stable thing. You want to tackle it very different than a very low volume, erratic item.
Mhm.
So that's segmentation. And as you get into that, and then you hear a lot of people talk about scenario and scenario planning. That is also even more important today than it's ever been, because not that we'll predict the right scenario that's going to happen, because we'll wake up tomorrow and it'll be something we never thought of, but it will help us better understand what levers we have and what those levers do. So when we wake up tomorrow and something crazy happened, we know, okay, if I turn this knob or turn that knob, this happens. And it gives you a better basis then to react to that surprise that happened the next day.
Exactly. And that, I think that's where your whole um statement comes in of disciplined application, right? That's really important. I would love to hear some kind of a story um from you where you are stripping down maybe like ERP manual steps or cycle noises to kind of reclaim that bandwidth for an organization. If you can share an example with us.
Yeah, and I think if we stick on the forecasting theme, I think it's a great one, because a lot of people, I see this and I've seen it many times. They say, well, we're going to forecast. And they start trying to get the commercial team and others to forecast everything. And that doesn't help because any, especially billion-dollar businesses, no one has the ability to put their arms around all of that. So you really want to take a more disciplined approach, and then back to that segmentation, right? I want to say, okay, if it's a high volume, stable item, I really don't want you touching that item. I want the statistics to work. It should be able to predict that very well. And if you make a change to that, it should be based on something that you have learned, and it should be a very valid change. On the other hand, if it's a high volume and not very stable item, boy, I want you to really be close to those customers. I want you to understand what's going on, and I want you to spend the time to give us a much better forecast on those because it will matter and will make a difference. And then at the lower end, if it's a, in that segment of the low volume stuff, and let's say it's very erratic with its demand pattern, maybe I want to fix that with buffering inventory because I know I can't forecast it. There's usually too many items. It's small, it's erratic. I'm going to kill myself trying to forecast it. So now let's fix that with an inventory strategy. So you got to really stay disciplined to that, or you'll find out you do a bunch of work and you're just making the
Mhm.
forecast worse. And if you're not measuring that and staying disciplined, you don't know that. But I've seen that so many times.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's kind of like, also I want to talk and bring it back to like the demand collapse strategy that I have read so much about. I know you were recognized by your board of directors for, repositioning inventory and stabilizing output. I believe there was a sudden demand collapse and there was a
Mhm.
lot of, rebound that came with it. So how do you, adjust to that, and if you can tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was a situation, it's been a number of years ago now, where really the chemical industry experienced a very quick collapse of demand. And the business that I was in, we did not have a lot of cash, to say the least. So taking the inventory out and not wasting cash on inventory was pretty critical. And when this happened, we managed through that, but there started to be a few signs that demand may come back and may come back very quickly. And presented the board with a plan that we were going to build ahead of that and capture the demand and not try to not lose out on that opportunity. And of course, there's a lot of nervousness because we didn't have the cash to spend. And what happens if you're wrong? So again, you get into in the scenario planning, the risk. What do you do if it doesn't happen? So we again, my favorite thing is segmentation. So let's look at the high volume stuff. Let's look at the lower risk items that we know eventually can sell, will sell, have always sold. Let's build that. And then the lower volume stuff, we'll have time to make it because we'll already have the high volume stuff made. And whether, I've been told it's better to be lucky than good. And this may be one of those examples because the demand did come back in a big way. We were well positioned and we had we had the best year of profitability that the business ever had. So the plan worked beautifully, whether it was skill or luck, we'll leave that up
We'll
to
call
somebody
it
else to
skill.
decide. Okay.
We'll call
I'll
it
take
skill.
luck
We'll
as
call it
well.
skill.
So
Perfect. And when we are, it's always fascinated me when we talk about, highest margin, commercial priorities versus, cutting, I guess, the long tail items, and
mhm.
all of those things that you move around when you're looking at product rationalizations in terms of margin. So what's your take on that? I know you've worked with different kinds of, targeted product inventories and rationalizations. So what's your take on that?
Well, complexity can be good or bad. Because if it's complexity that we get paid for and get make really good margins on, we'll do it, right? But what we end up having is a lot of complexity that we don't get paid for. And then it becomes a question, how do you find that? Because it's not easy because everything that you have in your portfolio was there for a reason at one time, and it's probably
Yeah,
special to somebody somewhere, right? So
yeah.
the key is start slow because everybody has some dead and discontinued things. They have some offsets that maybe we didn't finish the job of moving the customer to the newer product, et cetera. So, start small, tackle those things, and then continue to work back up that tail. And you end up, you know, almost doing a cube analysis because you're looking at not only, okay, it's low volume, it's low margin, it's all that, but you also got to look at who's buying it, what else are they buying, because it may be something that completes the system, right? Completes it's the part that makes everything else work. And so you've got to really get into that cube analysis then. So it gets much more complex as you move up the tail. But my experience is it's worth it to do that. And it's worth it, like I say, start small and keep working your way up because even that is pays big dividends.
Exactly. And when we're talking about, well, now with such a volatile demand environment, like how do you balance that whole technical trade-off between inventory at the source versus inventory at the hub? Like, especially when you're managing global shipping points, like how do you manage that?
Yeah, and I learned that a few years ago what was important. And when you think about it, inventory is there for a few reasons. One is the main reason it's there is, of course, to satisfy the customer. So
Mhm.
it needs to be in a position that it can satisfy the customer. So if the customer has a lead time of 10 days, but the inventory is 30 days away, it's not helping anybody. It's tying up our cash and not satisfying the customer. So it's important to understand what the customer requirements are and position the inventory to where it can be in danger of helping the customer.
Yeah.
So that is the key thing. The other thing that inventory can do is, I'll say, feed bottlenecks so that you don't lose time. So that's another key thing. So it's always important to understand why you have the inventory and make sure it's where it needs to be to solve that problem. And like I say, the biggest problem is satisfying customer demand. And that comes back to what is the lead time of the customer, and let's position the inventory where it's doing its job.
Exactly. And how do you like this always fascinate me. What you used to do 28 years ago is obviously not what you're doing now when it comes to inventory. Like how has that changed over the years and what have you seen working for you and not working for you?
Yeah, I mean the thought process is quite different, and actually I've spoke at some conferences sometimes, and some college professors that teach supply chain will come up to me after I speak, and they'll be like, "Boy, we don't teach it that way. Maybe we need
Yeah.
to look at it differently." Because back then, and you still see it in a lot of textbooks, everybody's like, keep your inventory in the raw materials.
Yep.
It's cheaper. Well, that's all fine and dandy and great, except for many complex businesses, it takes 2 months to go from the raw material to the finished good. So if all my inventory is in the raw material, customers aren't going to wait that long. So that's an example where things changed. And then, of course, the tools and the analysis that we can do these days is light years, from 28 years ago when we got email for the first time. So uh, that has changed the game quite a bit. And what we have to be careful of is that we recognize it as a tool and we use it to help us get better, but not replace some of the fundamental things that we do.
Exactly. I do kind of want to I know I'm like jumping a little, but I wanted to touch base on AI as well. Like how do you think AI has changed the whole output in the last what 1.5 years and
Yeah, and that's a very interesting topic because we see it everywhere now. And I would say I was very fortunate that I was dealing with, I'll say, AI like tools and AI
Mhm,
15, 16 years ago.
mhm,
Uh, and they can help. I've seen them help. I've seen them help in inventory optimization. I've seen them help in scheduling. And where I see them do the most help for those things is help us get to a point where we're now solving the problem and not
mhm.
just getting data lined up so we can see the problem. And I think that's where it can really help us is get us to the point where now we see what problems we got to tackle. AI can help solve some of those, but still requires, a pilot in the seat that can make some trade-offs and work more in the gray areas as we feed the AI to be better. So that's really what I seen. That's what I seen 15, 17 years ago, where we used it to, what would used to take lots of people putting together schedules. We could push a button and we would have a starting point of the schedule, and it could tell us these are the problems with the schedule. How would you like to proceed? Right. And that's where AI can help. But I think AI is here to stay. I think AI has a big place across the supply chain. I've deployed it from customer service through logistics, and it can help. And the tools that are coming out now are, like I say, a lot better than even the ones from 3 years ago.
Exactly. And that perspective is so important. Like we know what AI does, but it needs to kind of like, start solving the issues that you're presenting. And that's a new take I've heard, because everybody is like AI can help, but what do you need it to do for you, right? So I
Yes.
really like that. So when I look at kind of coming back to our conversation about inventory and warehouses, when you're looking at how you have managed several warehouses, and you've driven annual savings through those hubs or warehouses that you've dealt with, what was like your top data driven criterias, I guess, for selecting certain locations, to ensure like the customer services levels don't drop, or the timings are met in orderly fashion? Like how does
Mhm.
that process works for you?
Yeah, and I think what's important to understand is, you can stock better in one location than seven locations.
Yep.
Because now you have seven chances to screw it up versus one.
Yeah.
So the likelihood is a lot better that you'll screw it up if you have seven. So in general, you want to have fewer, not more. And then it comes down to, again, back to that customer expectation. And if we just take the United States, I mean, you can pretty much ship across the United States in 4 or 5 days. And so if the customer lead time is 15 days, then I don't really need to deploy inventory next to the customer, and I can still satisfy their demand. I can work a very good logistics partnership, get the inventory there when they need it, and everything's good. And I don't need to pay for the warehouse to do that. The other important aspect of warehousing is where's the source come from? Because if the source is beside the customer and I ship it on the other side of the country and then back, that doesn't make sense either. So you got to look, and there's again those AI tools and optimization tools that are out there that you kind of it looks at where's it made, where's it go, and what's the best network, and then you can play with that. And I will say, usually the answer is not, and this is I think to our earlier conversation about AI, it's not like you can push the button and it gives you the answer and then you go with it. I've never seen that yet. You push the button, it gives you some ideas and some thoughts, and then you tweak it some more, and then you push the button again, you look at it again, and then there's some criteria that pops up that you never thought about, and some things, labor and availability and all those fun things. So it's not automatic. It still requires us supply chain professionals to be at the wheel and driving it, but it can definitely help those complex optimization things that lead us down the path. And you can save a lot of money because, a lot of people end up, especially in a time when you're merging and acquire businesses, you wake up one day and you've got warehouses all over the place. And it's like, do I really need them?
Exactly. And Bully, I've been, obviously doing research and reading your profile. There was something that was mentioned about a European infrastructure investment, where you had successfully deferred over $50 million. What was that about? Tell us a little bit more, how reliable the European sector demands are, and how has that helped you over the years?
Yeah. So basically, we only had one central warehouse in Europe, and it was full. It was very over capacity. And to expand that, because it had a lot of automation and things, was a very expensive proposition. And
Yeah.
so, and plus we had some capacity issues in Europe as well. So when we took all that into account, the plan was, can we take advantage of some capacity we have other places in the world, like the US, like in Asia, and that lowers the demand, it lowers the demand on the warehouse, and we can satisfy the customers, whether it be in South America or in Asia, you know, and let Europe take care of just Europe. And so we was able to build that out. We were able to not do a big investment in a warehouse there. We ended up creating a second warehouse because it made sense to serve some more customers from a second warehouse that, were in different parts of Europe. And it really was a win across the board, and it was a good solution that was came up with to not only save money, but also I think it moved us in the right direction of taking care of capacity investments as well as taking care of the customer.
Wow. And when you look at, KPIs for these things, like, are there any specific indicators that you look at, or that you monitor to prevent, these incidents from happening and make sure you're going towards that? Because obviously, like, the future you cannot really predict, but what kind of KPIs are you looking at this point of time?
Yeah, and of course, everybody would say, well, I'm looking at my capacity, I'm looking at my warehouse capacity, my machine capacity, labor capacity, and all that. And that's uh, great answers, right? But the one thing that really pays off is to put together a 10-year plan. And maybe it's 5 year for some businesses, maybe some it needs to be 15, but at least in the chemical industry, I found 10 is a pretty good number
Yeah.
because it takes a few years to put capacity in place. And then, everybody's thinking, well, I can't predict my demand for tomorrow, let alone 10 years. That's okay too.
Yeah.
Do the best you can because, again, it's kind of like that scenario planning, right? Now you've put together the 10-year plan, you've highlighted the bottlenecks and when those are going to come, and you've put in place a strategy to tackle those and how long it's going to take you to fix those. And that becomes critical because now I'm looking back and saying, what's my trigger point to when I want to enact that plan? And
Yeah.
then you just refresh that once or twice a year and you see, are you marching towards what you thought you were? How close am I to the trigger point? As I start to approach that trigger point, I can refine the numbers and do a lot of different things, but I've got the answer on the shelf and I can move forward with it. And that has been a process that I've done a few times in my career, and it pays off over and over again. And you can take that even forward and really make it a full blown manufacturing strategy. You can do a lot with that process, and that's something one of the first things I always put in place, regardless of where I go.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, when you translate that into your latest, what you're working on, when it comes to the chemicals and especially the capex, right, that you've been working on. I believe you had commented once where a data was showing a 17% decline in the sector of capex. Especially, I think, in chemical companies that consume their asset bases. So, what do you look at in terms of technical risk? And it doesn't have to be just chemicals, but like in the supply chain reliability, I say 3 years down the line.
And I think, one of the things is to understand where you are, back to that 10-year plan. The second thing is optimization. You can generate capacity many different ways. I mean, one is as you start to see where you're consuming your capacity, challenge the manufacturing guys. They're smart people. They can squeeze out more capacity if they know that's the problem they need to go solve. We can do things in planning, to optimize the product wheels. That's something I've done a few times in my career, and you can really increase your throughput by doing that. Eliminate the downtime and the dead time. So there's a lot of things that you can do to increase capacity before you spend capital. And so those are extremely important. And then create options. Again,
Mhm.
if you're doing your scenario planning, you're doing the 10-year plan, you're looking out, the reason you're doing that is to create those options, those ideas, those strategies, because it's a lot easier to do now for a problem that we think is going to happen 4 years from now than wake up tomorrow and customers are screaming and we got problems, and then it becomes an expensive solution is the only solution.
Exactly. Man, I have so many other questions that I had in mind, especially from this conversation that we're having, but I know we're a little crunched on that. So I guess there's one thing that I always ask because the way you have, shown through your journey in terms of systems, in terms of thinking, how, how to keep things moving. You don't stop for anybody. You just see the barrier and you start making plans to work through it, right? So when it comes to supply chain maturity, or it comes to fractional or advisory information that you would like to pass on to the future generation that's coming in, especially in this new era of AI and technology, what is like your biggest um, piece of mind that you would like to give to everyone?
Well, I think one is simpler is always better, always has been, always will be. So be careful about building complexity. And that really applies to AI. Make sure you know the problem you're trying to solve, what the return is, because so many times, whether it's AI or automation or whatever the topic is, you see a lot of people doing it and it ends up spending a lot of money, but they really didn't get a return out of it. So make sure you know where the return is coming from, how you're going to measure the return, and challenge that multiple times, because to do AI for the sake of AI and to be first at it with no return doesn't help anybody, especially your company.
Exactly. And that's exactly right. Like a lot of people are doing AI first move right now. So I completely agree with you there. But Billy, thank you so much for joining us today, for giving us such wonderful um, points to carry with us for supply chain especially, but also the overall inventory and forecast. Any last words, any last comments before we end the podcast today?
I would just encourage people to stay in the supply chain profession. I think it's great. It's been great in my career, and like I said, let's. The world is changed quite a bit. It is much more volatile these days, and it just requires keeping many options in the supply chain. Do your scenarios, have your plans, and then wake up tomorrow and tackle it and keep moving forward.
Perfect. That was perfect, Billy. Thank you so much for your time and joining our podcast today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Yes, thank you very much.